Thanks for he raising that question of red corridor, and you invoking Dickens. This is the best of the times and this is the worst of the times. It's the best of the time in the sense that Gandhi's politics of satyagraha came to reality in that moment. In the sense that the even second line of leaders were jailed, third line of Congress leaders were on the streets, and Gandhi's satyagraha always emphasizes that you define what is satya, what is unjust, and you fight for it. Right? So that was all along it was happening. So leaders came from the third rung Congress, all through, especially in the south, it was true. I don't know what happened in the north, but in the south, which Quit India movement released a host of the Congress leaders from the third rung, third line of leaders. That is the best of the thing. That means Gandhi's satyagraha, which was, the meaning of satyagraha already had, been sown and has grown in political action. That's the one best thing happened. But the second thing was, through satyagraha, what social things you are going to define, and how to, two things which Gandhi always used to say, Gram Swaraj and untouchability. But unfortunately, it's the worst of the times in a sense that what Gandhi had promised Ambedkar during Pune Pact, that from here onwards, I will take on the question of untouchability as a movement, which was supposed to have been taken place during that period because it was leaderless, it was a constructive program, and Rajaji was outside. You should remember that Rajaji was not jailed because Rajaji was opposing that. Congress resolution, Rajaji was not part. Rajaji, who continued during 30s and 40s, where Rajaji led temple entry movements in Tamil Nadu, even from the opposition from the upper caste Congress, couldn't do anything for that removal of untouchability as a movement. So that was one thing which made Ambedkar ask the question what Congress and Gandhi did to untouchables. So that was the worst of the times. And secondly, the Gram Swaraj was never defined in that period. The independence was on the doors, where everybody knew, because 46 when he was suddenly asked to, you will be released by 8 o'clock tomorrow, the Aga Khan, Mumbai jail administrator comes and tells Gandhi, everybody knew that the movement is going on through the word, it's going on. So, but nobody in Congress, the third line leaders, thought it important, except few like Narayan Desai in Gujarat, to think of how to build a Gram Swaraj, how to make it structural, right? So it was quite absent. The untouchability movement was quite absent. The structural building of Gram Swaraj was absent. And thirdly, the worst part was, as you said, British used that period to sow the seeds of communalism and communal identity. So Gandhi never knew that communalism will grow to such an extent that at one point in 1947, when Nehru could say, even the best of the people have been communalized on both Hindu, Sikh and Muslim side. So Congress again, the third line of that means satyagraha defining the justice, caste system justice was out, Gram Swaraj justice was out, and communal harmony justice was out. That's the worst of the times. And his red corridor, unfortunately for the communists, it was a golden era for communists during non-cooperation movement, right? For the first time, they could define the rights of land. Tenants movement and labor movement started. They grew from it. Unfortunately, during 1942, they sided with the British. So they were the only party or only what I call movement in India which was free, and which could have done something to gain the mass, to build the mass movement and gain the popularity of the masses. Instead, the communists at that time had armed struggle as their this thing, and that is the time when they built Telangana. That is the time when they built the movement, armed movement in West Bengal. That is the time wherever the pockets, even in Kerala, the militant land struggle was on. So they thought in that direction, not extending their movement to masses, could not build a mass party. So, though the most free movement couldn't do a structuring of the party, it failed. This is a failure of the communists. So that's why they rethink now. 1942 was a golden time. They did it during non-cooperation movement, but they utterly failed during that 5 years period where they could have done. That's why Telangana movement was crushed by Congress. Telangana movement was crushed by Congress, but it was the strongest movement which was built, and who crushed it is Indian state. And together with Hyderabad rebellion, two things happened. They crushed Congress government, I mean, Patel did two things. One, crushed communist movement, almost concentration camp was built, and it was a Nazi concentration camp for Telangana movement. And secondly, the worst communal violence occurred during liberation of Hyderabad. Okay, so that's why I like. This was the best of the times. It was the worst of the times. It was the times where you can define, apart from abstract Gandhian idea of Gram Swaraj, abstract Gandhian idea of untouchability. And that is the only period where Ambedkar was active in rethinking his intellectual ideas. So I thank you for giving that metaphor.
I would like to speak about two issues. One is regarding connecting what Praveen sir has told about the British being, what Gandhi basically said about them being civilized. I would use sophisticated. And secondly, what Monish sir has spoken about, how multiple factors can be used to explain why India got freedom, or in this case, which I am trying to reflect on, is how the Gandhian thought process got widespread acceptance in India, and how Gandhi became a factor in uniting all of India. When we speak about the imperial powers, I think there is no second opinion as to British were better among them compared to others like Portuguese, who did all this slave thing and a lot of forced conversions and killings and all those things, or even something like Japanese imperialism. There is a part in Red Sorghum where it might be, though it's fictional, it might be derived from actual events. When one villager a Chinese villager was asked by the Japanese military person to skin another Chinese alive, and if he fails to do that, he'll call another person, another Chinese person, to skin the same person whom they have ordered to skin him alive. So that kind of thing was not there, fortunately, in India during British time. They were much more, as I said, sophisticated. So as a result, I think this provided a perfect base for spreading Gandhianism, which is more moderate in approach compared to what happened in, say, China, where Maoist ways were much more brutal and all those more extremist in that sense. And secondly, I would like to ask a question to Monish sir. You said about he wanted to have a discussion on nation building and into the context of states like Manipur. What I would like to ask you is that if something which united the whole of India as in India post 1947, is Gandhian philosophy and the fight against the British. If Gandhi was not a factor which has to be imposed on the students or the youth of Manipur through educational system, then what is the other thing which comes naturally to them, which can be used for nation building and national integration? Thank you.
Monish, you can also comment on why Europe Shamla Satyagraha is a token Satyagraha has become where Satyagraha is not real Satyagraha with support of the masses. That you are true, you are saying that Gandhian ideals stop at the border, right? And Europe Shamla Satyagraha is supposed to be the longest one possible, beating Gandhi. But why Congress or anyone? I am louder. Why Congress or anyone, any mass movements was against
Right. Any more questions? Maybe Monish can take one. You have a question? No. Fine. Then I'm giving you.
Yeah, all students, if you have anything, even a comment, very, very welcome.
Yeah. Over to you.
Okay. I I call this assault upon myself. But that's, I think whether or not I answer the question, that's the point. You raise something, right? Uh, Again, how to invoke Gandhi in Manipur? Uh, I don't know whether invoking Gandhi and invoking Gandhi as a curricula, it's a part of the whole process. But I think there has to be um, more measures in terms of building a national consciousness. Like, for example, I would say in every nation building process, there is a national memory, which is very important. And these are different for different countries. For us, it is supposed to be the freedom movement of India. The Manipuris had their, like, I was very surprised to find, actually, let me clarify that I have been co-opted enough into the Indian foreign policy establishment to really speak about Manipuri struggle and all those things, because whenever I go home, I'm on the other side. So I get all the onslaught from my friends who are on the other side. So I do not know if I am the real person to do this, but what I find is that there's not enough convergence happening in terms of like the most mention that you find in school textbooks, again very textbookish, of some element of movement in North. The Seven Sisters is Rani Gangubai in Nagaland, all those things. And even if you look at the Naga movement, NSC and IM, it has a very important connection to Gandhi himself, because Gandhi supposedly said in one of his meetings with Naga leaders that Nagas and the future independent state of India as a community would be able to have some kind of an autonomous sort of existence. I think the Fizo movement really caught into that rhetoric and then built a movement on their terms of how the sense of autonomy movement in Nagaland, which was again taken up by the ARM, NSC and IM as a secessionist movement in Nagaland. And it has come a full circle now. I will not go into that. But I think there is, for instance, I was very surprised to find that when a Manipuri delegation it came to Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, they had presented, a draft of things regarding blockade and all those things, issues. And in that it is written, and I read the draft, and it is written, Manipur once an independent kingdom of Southeast Asia. And we have a line of how the British came to Manipur and used Manipur as a station ground to fight the Anglo-Burmese wars, and how they came into the court politics of Manipur, and by 1891 the kingdom of Manipur was thrown away and the British garrison was put there. And it has its own lineage in terms of, for instance, after a war called the Khongzom War, which is supposed to be that big war, when the British finally defeated the princely state of Manipur, three important leaders of Manipur, including the prince or the Yuvraj of Manipur, was hanged in the open streets of Manipur. And that day is 13 August. And in Manipur, 15 August, I have never seen 15 August in Manipur. Because 15 August, till the time I have known, for my lifetime I have known 15 August and 26 January as Hartal and Ban. So it is, streets are clear, we can go out and play cricket on the street, that's all. Right? So I cannot remember the last time when there was a celebration in my state for 15 August or 26 January. For instance, Teachers' Day is celebrated, can be celebrated on any other day, but not 5th September, because it belongs to Radhakrishna birthday. So you see the element of divergence, in the mindscape. And for instance, I'll give you one concrete example of that divergence. The British blew the Kangla fort in Manipur and built this garrison there. Now, when insurgency movement started in Manipur, the Assam Rifles was planted there. And the Kangla fort is one of the most auspicious centers for the Manipuri, the so-called Manipuri Hindus, let's say. And you see the kind of divergence that it creates in terms of, like, we often hear this debate about, from Gora Babus to Brown Babus, right? So there is exactly the kind of sentiment that it dropped among the Manipuris, in the sense that the British blew the fort, built garrison there. Now the Assam Rifles are coming, and we are till now, till 20, I forget the year, but let's say 3-4 years back, we could never go inside the fort. It was a military garrison. Now it has been turned into a museum, which one can go in and pray and visit. So I think these are simple things, but things which really makes it easier for, even for, if we go by the terrorism thing, it really helps in terms of recruitment process, this kind of stories, okay? And I'll not go into I have to go into the ASFA because sir has pointed on Irom Sharmila. So I think there are many things that can be done in terms of at least identifying some of the issues where some convergence can be created, or created in terms of understanding at least, what happened in those regions during this period. There is a blank spot of what happened in Manipur, what happened in even among many of the states are carved out from the Assam Confederacy. So, but what happened in those states is a blank spot. We don't know. So I have given you a couple of examples where we had their own fight against the British, but somehow it is not connected to the larger national movement in India. So there's a divergence in terms of how do we create national memories then? How do you create that convergence of national memories that we can reflect upon and build what Benedict Anderson calls imagined community, right? How do we identify ourselves? For example, during the 2001 movement against the Nagalim issue, Greater Nagaland, why do Manipuri youths go out there to the assembly and burn an Indian flag? Now, how does that reflect? It's a symbolic thing. It's a very symbolic thing. So I think state presence is one of them that can be really looked at, where how and in one sense the state is present. As I have said, the meaning of state might be different for different people. It might differ among Manipuris also. It might be different for, as I said, I'm already co-opted, so I speak for India and all those things. But it might be a very different thing to speak to someone and say, what does Indian state mean to you, right? So I think we cannot shoo away these questions. These questions, for example, the inner line permit issue. It's nobody knows about it. I have not seen any news story on print media or anything really discussing this, but it's a big issue. It's an elemental issue of how do you define the other, inclusiveness. Because here we are talking about Lucas policy, Ekis policy, build highways to Vietnam, this and that. There they are talking about, there are NGOs which are actually telling kids to go out on the streets and agitate to bring in inner line permit, which will put restrictions on people coming from other parts of India for labor purposes or anything. But that's a very big question. You cannot, when you have constituencies discussing things like that, we cannot put a screen in front of them and say, you guys don't exist. I don't want to see you. They exist. And the only way we can confront and build a better nation is by confronting these difficult questions of how do we define. For example, the first time I taught a classroom, the first question that was asked, how do you see yourself? Do you really see yourself as a politically Indian or culturally like Southeast Asian kind of thing? And I often have a problem with the word, some phrases when we say, look, this policy, foreign policy, let's use Manipur as the gateway to Southeast Asia. Why do you want to use your own state as a gateway to some other place? Why don't we use? Why don't you say Myanmar is the gateway to Southeast Asia? So there are, I mean, these are rhetorics, these are nuances, connotations, I think, which are very important in terms of how you manage them, how you build narrative around them. Telling story, building narrative is a very important part of nation building. And I think it depends on how you build narratives. There is a certain narrative which is built among a certain section of population of Manipur. How do we go about managing that narrative? You know, we cannot shoo them away and say that your narrative doesn't exist. That will create all the more problems. Now, Irom Sharmila is remotely related to me because my uncle's wife is his sister. So I don't know how to really even capture the essence of Irom Sharmila because it's become such a part and parcel of our debates back in the state in terms of, you know, one day like whether it is really can be located in the structure of like looking at Satyagrahi or what do you mean, because when I see any debate on Indian television, the Satya that Irom Sharmila talks about is not the Satya for many leaders and military leaders of India. I think there's a sense in the sense that it's a political decision as long as you are designated as a disturbed state. How do you take out AFSPA from such a state? And the question of whether taking out AFSPA is really the solution to things in Manipur, because and this is the foreign policy thing coming in here from my side, in the sense that AFSPA, if you look at AFSPA, I think it's the product of something. AFSPA is there because there is a hardcore insurgency movement in Manipur, which is, I don't know how to even define the insurgency movement in Manipur, because you have something like 25 groups operating in the valley itself. And then you have the tribal groups in the hills. Then you have a Muslim group. So you basically have more than 30 odd groups operating in this small state of Manipur. With what demand, I don't know. You know, from 70s, like the 70s movement, which started with certain 3 basic groups with reported help from neighboring countries like China. You know, one of the insurgent group leaders was trained in Tibet and all those things. There was a certain leftist connotation, you know, in the lines of Che Guevara and all those things in that period. But now, if you look at the number of factions within the state, I don't know where it is really going. So, I think there is a larger reassessment needs to be done in about how we even talk about AFSPA, in the sense that are we striking at the root or are we just striking at the symptom? So, I think there is a sense whereby I also see some chinks in how we from our side as Manipuri NGOs and all, you know, including Bina Lakshmi, Nepram and other debate in terms of like, it's a debate, it's not a dialect, you know, it becomes a debate. I believe more in dialectic. Debate is like Bina Lakshmi comes with her certain point and then and Arnav Goswami gives her all the space to, you know, put her thing on the floor, and there is no budging from that position. So there is no dialectic happening here of finding something. There is a debate happening where there is a certain portion that the NGOs in Manipur, actually cottage industries have developed around Irom Sharmila. That's a fact. People have got fundings from all around the world, and people have gone and spoken to UN about Indian human rights issues in India. So there's even an issue of how do we really deal with, I think it really boils down to how do we really deal with a protracted conflict which has morphed over the years, you know, for 4 decades or so. Then you don't, my experience is that after a point of time, organization starts for something, after existing for 10 years to 15 years, it morphs into something else. It's not the same organization that it was there. So I think it's a very complex idea of how to really deal with conflict regions, you know, where conflicts have happened for such a long time, and how do we really define how we have defined our nation as such, right from Gandhiji's period to how we look at certain elements of the state and how we try to engineer a better way of managing the so-called problem states of India. Right? So I can carry this over, but I'll end here.
Thank you very much, Monish. We all would agree that this was really a very interesting and, the session of intense discussions, not dialectic, right? Yeah. So, but one thing possibly, maybe, and I would like to conclude this session here after saying this. The essence that we can carry on, after this discussion, that what possibly Gandhi left as a legacy to us, that, the tolerance. So the state has to tolerate to different point of view, diverse points of views. So nothing that, if it is coming something which is diverse and alternative, so that need not be considered as an opposition or always something that is an attack on the state. So that's where possibly Indian state also has to tackle, also has to co-opt, also has to address the issues. So, yeah, we can stop you. You want to say something? Yeah.
Because I think Indian leaders invoking Gandhi has become very bizarre, vague, and hypocritical. Because at one point of time, you talk about Gandhian philosophy and politics. At that point of time, you go and kill thousands of innocent people on roads who are just pelting stones on you with bullets. How is that Gandhi politics to me? Because for me, AFSAPA is a flawed piece of legislation which has created trust deficit between Kashmiris and New Delhi. And I don't want people to take me as an anti-national, because I believe Kashmir was an integral part of India. It is an integral part of India, will remain an integral part of India. But yes, this is a flawed piece of legislation which has, created trust deficit. And here, political leaders invoking Gandhi becomes very vague and bizarre.
You want to answer, or maybe we can stop, or you want to answer? Yeah, but one thing, possibly I would add to that, simply if you are trying to look at the specific issue that you have raised that has a specific context, number one, and number two, there are diverse things related to that, not simply in the context of a state having a legislation which is, which has its own role, or maybe that can be seen as something draconian, or the kind of effect it leads to as far as the people are concerned. So there are a lot of external internal dimensions to that. So that would be separate debate altogether. But still, and I'll leave it to the speaker the way he wants to.
Okay, interesting point. I think this again I would locate it within the debate of reforms of governance within India, including police reforms. And the fact of the matter is that, as often Ravi sir and me discuss about how for the British, India was sometimes a testing ground for certain laws and certain resolutions, in terms of even the fact that, the kind of inheritance that we brought off from the British in terms of even the Intelligence Bureau, or many of the mechanisms in which many of our law enforcement agencies work. I think AFSPA, the problem with AFSPA is also, in terms of how we inherited certain repressive measures from after the British went, in the sense that the problem, I think there has to be, even if there has to be AFSPA, I think there has to be a rather debate on how, like for example, there have been recommendations made on how AFSPA can be reassessed, but nothing has been done on it right now. So I think the problem, let's say the conceptual problem that AFSPA causes, is that when certain laws were done during the British government in India, that was done with the idea of looking at the population, looking at the Indian citizenry as a object of suspicion. A section, and there was, I think that was a different context altogether, right? Indians were fighting for the struggle, British were against it. So I think there was a larger element of how the Indian population or the Indian freedom struggle was looked at with a certain suspicion. So I think the conceptual problem with things like OSPA is that it gives, it, as you said, it builds a sense of distrust. It builds a sense of a state looking at a population with a certain amount of suspicion. That I think comes with, as I said, it's a problem. It's a complex issue, but because OSPA was not put on Manipur or Kashmir without any problems. There are problems in the states. There are insurgencies in the states, but the thing is, how do you create a system whereby you can, and I think it's a very complex thing, and we, as being IR scholars, we have seen it all around the world in terms of how any counterinsurgency process, of how do you fight a problem whereby you are trying to create confidence among the same people from where the other person is also recruiting. So there's a double-edged sword in a sense. Like, it's not different kinds of people. You know, you are, even if I take the case of like the problems of in fighting Taliban in Afghanistan, the problem is that you are trying to win the hearts and minds, if I use the American dictum, hearts and minds of the same people from the same people the Taliban are also recruiting. So I think that is a very complex issue in the sense that when you are fighting an insurgency, counter-insurgency process, you are trying to win the hearts and minds of, let's say, the Manipuri people or the Kashmiri people, from within which the insurgency movement is also created. So how do you create that divide where you fight an insurgency force, but at the same time, how do you make sure that it doesn't create a suspicion in the larger populace as such? So I think it's a very trying times in terms of how do you really manage that thing of fighting something from which the insurgency force is also recruiting. So I think that's one of the major problems that we face.